Hi, my name is James Rozak. I am the creator of the website Morning Mercy. This podcast is dedicated to supporting those of you who are on a journey away from the teachings of William Branham. If you haven't tuned into my last episode, I was talking about my experience coming into the message, and today I'm going to be talking about my experience through and the reasons why I came out of the message. So if you hadn't listened to my previous episode, I'll just give you a little summary. I was born and raised in the message till I was about 7 years old. My parents left in the midst of a church split and the discouragement that they experienced at that time. Upon leaving the message, my parents never shared with me their reasons for their leaving. There was never a point in time where we openly discussed the changes that we were going through. I know it was a very confusing time for them as well, having just left the message, having family dynamics in play, which most of us who were raised in the message would understand those complicated family situations. And so, it was just dead silent. And I had a grandmother who was very zealous in sharing with me through my teenage years and into early adulthood, just putting pressure on me to remind me about the message, tell me why I needed to come back, tell me that she was believing that I was going to be the reason my entire family got saved, etc., etc. And that really put me in a position of confusion because I believed my grandmother and what she was sharing with me. I had no defense against it because I knew no reason why we left the message in the first place. It seemed like it was a good thing. It led to a depression because I was very isolated and confused. And eventually I found my way back to the message because it seemed that that was my answer to finding myself. And so that's where I'm going to pick up. Coming back to the message. Because I had gone through such a dark phase of depression, the immediate result of me coming to church was my depression was gone instantly. Like I never, ever struggled with depression again. So again, that was a confirmation for me that I was in the right place. I felt a peace in my heart that I had never felt. Something that I didn't even know existed was a thing called love bombing. And without question, I was surrounded with people with a great excitement for my being there. I had a good story. I was able to share the story of my childhood, my coming up through the world, and now coming back to the message. Everyone wanted to hear my story. And so I talked about it far and wide. And whenever I was able to share my experience of coming back to the message, I did. It was very transformative for me. And so, it felt so good to be loved in the way that I was feeling loved. It was also easy for me to fit in because I had held myself to a very high standard. Even though I didn't understand the message, even though I wasn't a Christian, I felt like I was living a somewhat holy life compared to people out there. I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, I didn't go to parties. And when I did go and hang out with people in a social context, I was different. I never participated or invested myself in the way that other young people would. And so I was relatively pure coming out of the world and into the message. I was very eager to throw away my past. I was very eager to learn what it was to be a Christian. I was very invested in reading the message and listening to the tapes. I mean, I carried tapes with me wherever I went, constant and all the time. Lunch hour, I would run out to my vehicle. I would sit in, eat lunch in my vehicle and listen to tapes. Whenever there was anything happening at church at all, church meeting, prayer meeting, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday, Friday meeting services that were happening in other churches. I mean, I was showing up wherever I could. I got baptized probably I would say 4 or 5 months after I started coming to church, and pray constantly, to be filled with the Holy Ghost. And I could see the evidence and the fruit happening in my life. I was always looking for a testimony. I was just hungry, just absolutely hungry. I had some friends who were Christians who I would talk about, and they were excited for me at first because when I came to church, then they were thinking like, wow, you're a Christian now. And so we could fellowship them. I thought they'd be excited to hear what I was learning about. I didn't still recognize that the message outside of the message wasn't looked upon very well, that William Branham had a very bad reputation in the greater context of Christianity. I had no clue. I was oblivious to that. So I would share messages with some of my friends, and they would begin to look up William Branham. Now, this is 1998, 1999. It's not like there was a great amount of information on the internet at that time. The internet was relatively new, but there was information. And some of my friends would send me links for things to read, including a man by the name of Alfred Pohl. And if you don't know who that is, he was somebody who was with William Branham when he visited Canada. And he was doing a sweep across parts of Canada in the healing ministries. They were having healing campaigns, and Alfred Pohl went with him to many places. And he began to document his experiences, particularly when he began to realize that many of the claimed healings that William Branham proclaimed, they were in fact not having the results that William Branham was promising. William Branham would declare, "Thus saith the Lord, you're healed in the name of the Lord." And then Alfred Pohl, in his follow-up, would recognize that not everybody was healed. In fact, there were a lot of people passing away and dying. So I was presented with a website about Alfred Pohl and the things that he said about William Branham. And I remember reading them, and without doubt, it having just a major impact on me. It shook me up without question. And they also began looking up things like serpent seed and different teachings that William Branham had. And so I had friends say, "Hey, did you know that William Branham taught that it wasn't fruit in the Garden of Eden, that the serpent and Eve had intimate relations?" And that sounded crazy to me because I still only understood the version that, everyone knew about the Garden of Eden. And so I was like, that's crazy. No, he didn't teach that. I would tell them. Then I would go to my pastor and I would say, "Hey, this is what my friend said. Is this true?" And my pastor would pull up the quotes and he began showing me. And I remember being really tripped up by a lot of those first introductions to doctrine. I was introduced to the things that William Branham said about women. Yeah, it was difficult because I was getting this information very early. And in one way, it could have saved me from the years that I would have thereafter. But I was in this dilemma of being love bombed, of being celebrated for being in the church, of feeling that relief from depression. What I was experiencing seemed like there was nothing bad about it. There was no reason for me to be worried. So it was very easy for me to just outright dismiss the warnings and red flags that I was receiving at that time. And I did. Absolutely dismissed them. I took a little bit of time to ground myself more in the teaching. I really dove into the church ages, into the 7 seals, into all of the doctrines of the message. And those things began to really settle. The first exciting things that I had was the understanding of water baptism, the revelation of serpent seed. When those things began to really hit me, I was so excited because I was understanding what William Branham was teaching, and it all made sense to me. And so I began to teach in Bible study groups that we were having. We would gather, a bunch of young people would gather in somebody's home. We would go through the church ages. We would go through the church ages is where we really started. having these home Bible studies. And it led me to going back and begin to preach from the pulpit in our church. And quickly that progressed. It wasn't that long too where I began going on to the mission field. I traveled to the Ukraine with several brothers who were well known in the message. So I was in the Ukraine just tagging along, carrying equipment and just absorbing the experience of seeing people from other countries. I got to take an early trip to South Korea as well. Again, going into churches in South Korea and spreading. There was very little in the message in South Korea, but so I was there breaking new ground, so to speak, and visiting the few groups that were there, fellowshipping with them, going into other groups, non-message groups, and just handing out books and having that experience as well. And that was very exciting for me to be introduced to another part of the world. I had gotten married then to a young lady from the church in Edmonton. We had children. We began, just being more and more involved in the church, our local church. I was then beginning to minister in the United States and across Canada to various church assemblies. I went back to Ukraine to not just be somebody carrying bags, but I ministered in Ukraine. I went to Poland and ministered in Poland. Yeah, it was just very grateful and thankful to be preaching and to be contributing to the spreading of the message. But certain things began to really impact me as I was going through the experience. I was, beginning to counsel with more people. And one thing I really began to note was wherever I went, there's just a great number of people who were having trouble finding basic salvation. They were just in such doubt about being saved. And I was confused by that, but the more I thought about it, the more I recognized that so often what we did in the message is we were trying to bring people into an understanding of who William Branham was and what the message taught. But were we actually bringing people to Christ? That was my question. And it began to bother me because I realized that we just weren't focused on preaching the gospel. And that bothered me a lot. So in my own ministry, I began trying to steer to the basics of preaching the gospel. It was certainly something that began to really consume me. And it actually bothered me when we would go into meetings and I would hear the preacher preaching very lofty things about revelation, when I knew in that congregation there were so many people just wrestling, trying to get air, so to speak, spiritual air. They weren't even sure if they were saved. I had a few pivotal moments that happened. One of them was going to New Zealand and visiting with a pastor in New Zealand who, I'm not going to name names, but it was a man who I really loved and I thought very highly of. He was just a real good man. And he introduced me to some things that I had never seen before, and one of which was a show called E-Tao. E-Tao was a story of a Mennonite man who tried to get into Bible school, I believe. So he really wanted to go onto the mission field and do something for God. But he wasn't allowed to go down that path. He followed his heart and he went to a tribe in Papua New Guinea and he began ministering to a group of very primitive tribal people living on this island of Papua New Guinea. They were pagan, they believed in their own version of gods, which, being introduced to the Christian God was something new for them. And they allowed this man to come and live among them. And he began to introduce them to the gospel by starting off in the book of Genesis and just introducing them to the idea of sin and where sin comes from and how man was failing. And so that God had to introduce to them laws. And by introducing to them laws, to be saved, so to speak, to avoid the wrath of God, they had to follow these laws. But following laws resulted in them failing because they couldn't keep the laws. So to compensate for their failures, they had to sacrifice a lamb, and that blood sacrifice was salvation to them. It washed their sins, but they had to do this routinely, ritually, to atone for the sins that they had. And then it went further to him introducing Jesus and how Jesus became the sacrificial lamb. He never outright told them that Jesus was the sacrificial lamb, but he talked about how Jesus paid this price with his life. And the revelation dawned on these people that it was that Jesus became the substitution rather than the blood of lamb and goats. And when that revelation began to hit, they began to declare, "Etau, etau," like that's the truth, that's right, that's what that means. And you could just see the jubilation wash over the tribe, and it was all videoed, so it was real time. You're actually watching the revelation hit these people. And as a result, this entire tribe of people were saved. And I remember watching that, and it bothered me. On one hand, it was so exciting. On the other hand, I was watching this man do something that was rarely, if ever, seen in my experience in the message, because we were so focused on bringing people to the message and believing the prophet, that this experience of salvation was so rare. I don't remember preachers doing what this man, this Mennonite man, did. And that bothered me. So when I came home from New Zealand, I presented this video to our congregation, and that really affected my ministry from that point. I really felt like the people who came up in the prayer line in our church, constantly and forever asking for the same thing, struggling with the same thing. It didn't make sense to me why, after all this time, they couldn't get over their block. And that made me think we need to get down to basics of just salvation. Like, forget revelations of the message. We need to get back to basics of the gospel. So that was one thing that was very pivotal for me in recognizing that my ministry needed to go in that direction. I also was leading a lot of Bible studies, and that again characterized the way that I led youth groups. I just wanted them to be intimate with the idea of the gospel, on that the salvation was based on their faith, not on their works, not on their sanctification. And that was another thing that I began to have trouble with, was the teaching that William Branham had of adoption. Because in one way, although he was saying it was that we were saved like Luther taught by faith, he layered that there was also a sanctification that had to occur before you could be filled with the Holy Ghost, like the glass that was in the farmer's pen, that was covered in mud, and it had to be picked up, and then it had to be washed and cleaned out, and then only then it could be filled with the Spirit, so to speak, so that it could be put into use. And that teaching, it felt like that was hindering people, because people would, in their mind, they're thinking, "Oh, I'm saved by faith, but now I have to be sanctified to the satisfaction that God will accept me and fill me so that I could be used." And the sanctification process in the message, if we're honest, involved a whole lot of law, a lot of do's and don'ts, a lot of law keeping. And so it was a conflicting message. Like, are you saved by faith or aren't you? And if you are, then sanctification, the way it was taught. And again, William Branham layered on the teaching that, he used the analogy of the train car, where the inspector would come to the train car. And before that train could go on the journey, presumably into glory, the train couldn't move until every car was inspected. And the cars represented us as people. And the inspector would come and check every little piece, every part of that train car to make sure everything was in its right place and secure. And William Branham used that as an analogy to say, your life needs to be completely 100% in order before the train can go. Again, that message was, it's up to you to make sure that your life is so perfect. Perfection. You had to attain perfection before God would accept you and put the seal that you were inspected and improved and approved. That put people on this constant journey of trying to make sure they were right and then struggling in their body, in their flesh. And then that made them question their faith that they were saved at all. And so they were in this cycle of like, well, yeah, but I'm saved by faith. And I believe that I'm saved, but my life isn't perfect. And therefore, I don't know if I'm saved. So it was sanctification came before justification. You weren't justified unless you were sanctified. That's what the message was teaching a whole lot of people. So these were questions I was having. I didn't doubt the message, not at all. But I was thinking that we needed somehow to present the gospel differently. We had to bring people to Christ. And it was confusing for me because there were much better preachers. I never claimed to be a good preacher. But what I could see was that we needed to improve somewhere. But I was also really bothered in the congregation when I saw there was a lot of people struggling within themselves with past pain, past trauma. You would sit down and you would talk to somebody and they would bring up things that happened to them and they couldn't seem to get past it. And it didn't seem like it was enough for somebody to just be prayed for and send them to the books and to the tapes as though that was going to deliver them from past pain. I felt like something more needed to be done. And it was around that time we were introduced to a concept called caring for the heart. Caring for the heart was being practiced by I think there was only one person in the message that was doing it. It was out of the church in Ohio. A minister was doing marriage counseling using the principles of caring for the heart. Caring for the heart came from a man by the name of John Regier. John Regier was out of Colorado Springs. He was a Baptist minister, I believe. And it was very unorthodox for a message person to go to a Baptist minister to gain counseling material so that you could go and you could help people in their marriages, in their personal situations, to find healing so that they could become a better person, a more whole person, so that when they entered into marriage relationships, they weren't a husband and a wife stepping on each other's toes and not understanding why they couldn't communicate and why they couldn't connect. I believe wholeheartedly that there's a lot of marriage issues in the message because there's no teaching on how to overcome the struggles that a married couple might have. And the idea is two individuals that are bringing in personal baggage into a relationship. It's not just going to magically go away. And it's not just going to go away because you have two people claiming to be filled with the Holy Ghost. When people don't know how to communicate and connect, they don't know how to communicate and connect. And when they're butting heads and they don't know why they're butting heads, and when they're running into walls and they can't get around those walls, it's not enough to hand them a message book and say, husband, love thy wife. What does that mean? Husbands, love your wife like Christ loved the church. Well, yes, it's sacrificial. Sure. What does that mean to be sacrificial? And what does that have to do with a boy who from childhood was severely abused in various ways? And now he doesn't know how to open up and he doesn't know how to love himself, let alone love his partner. And there's a lot of complicating layers involved in that, and there's no tools. Read your Bible and pray. That's not quality advice for somebody who's dealing with, say, childhood physical abuse from a parent who physically beat them. It's complicated and touchy stuff. So when I heard about caring for the heart and my pastor was willing to go down that avenue, in fact, it was my pastor who brought that minister from Ohio into our church, and we spent some time looking into it and experiencing it a little bit in our congregation. And our pastor wanted to bring that teaching to our congregation. So what did he do? He sent me and my wife to Colorado Springs to learn to do caring for the heart. And that interested me greatly because, again, in context of the message, I felt like we were lacking. I know a lot of people would call this psychology, and a lot of people did. And a lot of people were very wary of me doing this. But I was willing to go down that road because I really believed that in order for some people to be free, to have the chains broken from their life, and to find the kind and quality of deliverance that was promised in the ministry of Jesus. Like if we are to take on the Spirit of Christ, well, then Jesus said that he was sent here, to mend the brokenhearted, to set the captives free. He was here for healing. And if people aren't being healed from the things that most heavily weighed on them, it wasn't enough to just belong to the message. Yeah, so I went down this road. I went to caring for the heart, and me and a couple people from our church went. There was another minister from Quebec who went, and it was life-changing. For me, it was life-changing because we got to observe for a week. We sat in observation of John Regier, providing counseling to couples who are seeking help in their marriages. And we saw couples come into his office screaming and shouting at each other, unable to communicate, unable to connect. And when they would open up about some of their issues, you could watch the trigger that would be pushed in the partner, and the partner would emotionally shut down and react either outwardly or shut down and go inwardly and not be able to talk it out. You could see these situations happen. And yeah, you could say, oh, well, that's because they weren't message believers. So here's the phony part about the message. The message would say that we have the best marriages and they're the healthiest marriages. I didn't believe that. I don't believe that. If you ask me my opinion today, I would say there's a lot of suffering people in suffering marriages because they have no resources and no tools. What it did for me personally was I was sitting there listening to him describe the pain that he was observing in these married couples. And he would trace back to their childhood and unveil, I guess you could say, things and experiences, traumas, abuses, moments when something happened to them that in message terminology, it was like there was a complex that began to form in an individual. And from that point on, they were guarded. They were protective of their heart. It was like they stayed permanently a little boy or a little girl inwardly. And whenever something would happen to them where they were made to feel unsafe or made to feel the way they did when they were a child, they would respond like that little child, hiding and protecting, running away from trouble. And they would shut down. And I recognized myself in that. I went back to my own childhood and recognized my inability to be free in certain areas of my life was very much tied to what happened to me as a child. And I remember sitting in a Wendy's with my wife. My wife was asking me how I was feeling. And I was able to articulate for the first time how I was feeling and how I was beginning to connect some dots from my childhood on what had happened to me to where I would behave in certain ways. Yeah, it was very life-changing for me. I'm going to go into this in a lot of detail after this, by the way. I'm going to fully explain caring for the heart, and I'm going to take maybe a few podcasts on that because I feel like this is critical for a lot of people who are still in the message and for people who are coming out. And it's not that I'm saying you need to do this. I'm saying many of us have need for healing and counseling, and we need help beyond what we know. And that help will begin to unlock parts of ourselves that are wounded, and we don't recognize it as being wounded. To carry on with my story, though, what I began to realize in that time in Colorado Springs was I was listening to a man who was not a message pastor, and he was dispensing knowledge and wisdom far beyond anything that I had witnessed in any time that I was in the message. Far more practical wisdom, actual tools that would help people find freedom. It bothered me that us in the message would look down on this man as though he was a lesser Christian than us. And I felt like this man was doing more constructive help for people than anything I had observed in any message pastor that I had ever witnessed. And here I am sitting in his office, and I'm calling myself the bride, and I'm looking at this man, and he is technically, potentially cannon fodder. Even though he's doing a great work, he's a denominational man, he was familiar with the message because he had run into people who were in the message before. He didn't believe in William Branham. He might even refer to William Branham as a false prophet. So this was a man destined to have the mark of the beast. And yet look at what he was doing. It was messing with my understanding of the way we understood the bride and what really constituted a real Christian. Yeah, so I came home. I, of course, still believed the message, but I was determined to take what I learned in Colorado Springs and bring it back to the message and to begin to really help people. I really felt like we could. In fact, that's what Morning Mercy started as. I started as a website, and I was going to begin to unload content intended to help people in the message. I was going to go in that direction, and I was going to be willing to risk repercussion. I began counseling in our church very heavily. I was counseling marriage situations. I was counseling individuals. I was counseling people who were struggling through all kinds of personal trauma. And that was the thing that is a cornerstone of caring for the heart, is you begin to make people feel completely unjudged and safe so that they feel like they can open up and pour out their heart. That's the whole cornerstone of how caring for the heart works. If you feel like you're going to be judged for something you say, you're not going to say it. If a husband feels like he's going to be judged for confessing something to his wife, he's not going to say it. If a wife is feeling something from her husband and it's really affecting her, if she's going to share that part of herself with her husband, but she feels like she's going to be shut down and judged, she's not going to say it. Same thing with a pastor speaking to a congregation member. If that congregation member feels like the only thing that he's going to be handed is the rule book and told you have to go back to the rule book and start doing the things that you're supposed to do, like listening to tapes, like abstaining from this, like letting go of that. If it's that kind of advice that they're going to get, well, they've done that. They've been trying that for a long time. They're going to feel unheard. They're going to feel like there's no hope, and they're not going to confess or open up about those parts of themselves. So that was the realization of, in order to help people open up, I had to make them feel completely safe, like they could tell me anything, and I won't meet them with messageology. That I would meet them where they're at, and we would begin to work very openly, very, very honestly with the situation that they're in. So yeah, I began having people come and talk to me and tell me things that they were going through that they've never told anybody. I heard some things that I can't repeat, that I'll never repeat. But I heard things that are very unflattering of leaders in the churches, of pastors, of fathers, of mothers, of family situations, of husbands and of wives. And it's, again, I almost don't blame them because we were taught to behave this way. But I felt passionately like we had to begin undoing or correcting or changing our trajectory and the path that we were on in the message to really begin to help people. I hadn't fully learned how to do this. I was learning how to do this. For the first time in my ministry, I felt like I was able to do something beyond just preaching a sermon. We had hundreds and hundreds of sermons fed to us every year. We needed something more. And I believe that absolutely. Still, more than ever, the people in the message need something more. And it's not just the message. All of us could use something more beyond the limitations of what we think is possible. It was around this time when I was being introduced to something that was happening in the underbelly of the message. Now, to go back a little bit and talk about Believe the Sign. Believe the Sign began as a missionary tool by a young man from Cloverdale Bible Way. I'm by profession, I'm a web designer and a graphic designer. So this young man came to me and he said, I want to build a website. So that's what I did. The Believe the Sign logo that you see today, I designed that. There were business cards and bumper stickers and all kinds of things that were being created and handed out for a period of time. And I created all of that because I was very invested in the idea of spreading the message. And there was no real powerful tool online that I was aware of that actively provided quality missionary material for the spreading of the message. And so that's what Believe the Sign was supposed to be. It was a resource for finding information about prophecies, about things William Branham said on all kinds of topics, so that if somebody were, witnessing to somebody about the message, they could say, hey, check out this website, Believe the Sign. What began to happen, though, was that young man, as he was piecing together information to put on the website, began recognizing there was a lot of conflicting things that William Branham said. So he was beginning to have trouble. And there was a small group of people involved in that where they began having some dialogue around some of the conflicts that were coming up. There was a little group on Facebook where there was discussions happening, and a member of my church in Edmonton was privy to this group that was beginning to meet online and discuss some of the issues. And so I was interested to know, what are they talking about? So I got introduced to this group. There was a couple other ministers in there. There was some other well-known people in the message in there. It wasn't a big group, but it was a group of people just sharing information. And they weren't outright saying that William Branham lied. They weren't at that level, but they were just saying, what do you think about this? William Branham said this here. William Branham also said this and this. None of this seems to make sense. So they would kick around ideas and thoughts about that, introducing issues like the cloud and William Branham not being there at the time that he said he was there, etc., etc. I'd never heard of any of these issues before. So it was somewhat shocking to me. And I went back to my pastor very quickly and I said, hey, are you aware that this is happening? And there's a few members of our church that are a part of this group. What do we do? And we decided to do nothing. And I would just keep tabs on what was happening. And I would share that information with my pastor every once in a while. And he didn't seem very concerned. But after a while, it became more serious. And then it got to a point where Believe the Sign shared an announcement called Humble Pie, where they began expressing an apology because they had come to the conclusion that there were some serious errors in the message. And they were no longer going to hide the fact that these errors were on the table. And there had to be kind of a reckoning of getting to the bottom of what was really going on. And so from there, of course, Believe the Sign was now very widespreadly known as being a problem to message churches, to message ministers. And from there, we know it turned into a big deal. Some of my good friends were involved in that and were coming to our pastor with questions. They were getting no answers. So I started going out for coffee with some of the people in our church, just really concerned. And I began doing my own research, trying to find answers. I could find no answers. And the more that I dug into it, the more I began to realize, yeah, there's a bit of a problem here. I wasn't still doubting the message. I just knew that I couldn't find answers. And so I was in waiting mode, waiting for, say, my pastor to come up and preach something significant to dispel the issues that were being illuminated. There wasn't a single minister in any congregation who seemed to have a clear response. My pastor said some things which were very disturbing to me about the way he was handling the situation. He said he had all the answers, but he was going to not share them for his own personal reasons of thinking that the person who was asking the questions should experience the pain of not being able to find answers himself. I'm not sure why that was going to be helpful. I'll be honest, I came to the conclusion that my pastor had no answers, and he didn't, and he doesn't. And I say that very confidently because I have yet over the course of my leaving the message to hear a single quality response to any issue that was raised. But again, I was still in the message and believing it wholeheartedly. I just felt like there had to be an answer that somebody would have to settle the issue. But the more I saw the threats coming from pulpits, no answers, it was bothering me a great deal. I just put my head down and continued to counsel and help people in our church. I continued to do everything I could in ministering the way I did. I really did begin to focus on the gospel more than on quotes from William Branham. I just felt that was an important thing to do. And the big final thing that happened to me was I went to Tennessee to preach a youth camp. It was a very well-known youth camp, the Winter Youth Retreat in Michigan. It was happening in Tennessee in this particular year. I was invited to be one of the main speakers. And I went there and my intention was to speak about complexes. I was going to preach from what I was learning through caring for the heart. I felt like it was the only thing that was on my heart. And I felt like it was extraordinarily needful. It was not being taught or it was not known outside of our little group, really. No one was teaching it the way that I was understanding it. And so I went and yes, I taught using message quotes, using scripture verses. I taught what I felt like was an honest sermon about how young people within their message lives could be damaged by people close to them, and that results in complexes that William Branham talked about. And when they get these complexes, they get a locked heart, and they're no longer able to freely communicate with God. They're not fully able to understand their own salvation. They're not able to find freedom in the way that a Christian should experience freedom. And there were answers to that. But I was doing it in a very honest way. Like, yes, your pastor could hurt you. Yes, your parents could hurt you. And those aren't intentional. Those are circumstances of life. It did not go over well at all with the ministry. It went over extremely well with the kids at that camp. I cannot tell you the response that I got. It was the highlight of my ministry. For weeks and months after those meetings, I had messages from kids from the series of services that I preached there. People disclosing things that they had never disclosed. Even in that meeting, I had deacons coming to me asking for meetings, wanting to disclose marriage trouble that they were having. I had kids asking for an audience with me in those meetings. And they were disclosing to me things that were happening in their homes, within their families. Kids saying that they didn't want to go back home because there was such a high level of difficulty in their homes. And they described the difficulties they were having, and they were heartbreaking. But again, the other ministers at that camp were not in agreement with what I was doing. They issued a reprimand to me. It must have went back to my pastor, because from that point I was never asked to preach another service. I was kind of put on the shelf, and my pastor, when I got home, went into full-fledged message preaching. I'd never heard him preach in those ways. He was full out, 100% preaching William Branham is the way. In fact, verbatim, rather than saying Christ is the door, he would make statements, basically saying that William Branham is the door. And of course, meaning that William Branham was Christ for our day, and the only way to get to Christ was to go through William Branham. Yeah, it was just very strong, very pointed, very, I would call it angry preaching. It definitely, I don't know if his intention was to shake me up, shake the congregation up, maybe to prove that he was a message preacher, because he was the one who enabled me to preach caring for the heart. And now he did a full swing back. The behavior that I saw for the next while was shocking. I had at that point approached my pastor and told him I had concerns about the message, because the red lights were flashing, the red flags were flying. I was concerned. I told my pastor I was concerned, and yeah, he had nothing to say other than that he felt like I was having a nervous breakdown, that I needed to take a break from everything, preaching, counseling. I needed to take time to get my head back on so that I could align myself with William Branham, because William Branham was aligned with Paul's teaching, which was the basis of the scripture. Yeah, that's the way it went from that point. And it culminated to a moment where our pastor brought me on stage, announced to the congregation that they loved me, that I was having a very difficult time, that they needed to encourage me because I was potentially having a nervous breakdown. There was a lot of confusion of what was happening, and I walked out of the church for the last time on that day, and I never came back. And I didn't disbelieve the message. I wasn't ready to say that William Branham was a false prophet. I just felt like there was a lot of rethinking I needed to do. So that's what I did, full-fledged digging into the message. And if ever I had read the message and ever studied the message, I did more studying and reading from that point than I had ever done. That was my journey out of the message. I left the message in March of 2013. My wife, through her own observations, was beginning to recognize the same concerns that I had. There was a handful of other people in our church that were recognizing the same concerns that I had. So on the day that I left, there was a group of us that left. Me and my wife would begin attending other churches. It was a different experience, but we were just willing to reconsider what it was that we believed. It was not my favorite part of my life, but I did not regret whatsoever. The testimony that I had all along was that it was God bringing me into the message from this point when I was a child, going through many, many things that were traumatic and difficult. And then coming into the message was just the hand of God leading me in. And then I began to recognize that actually my childhood experiences had set in my mind a pattern of pain and a pattern of behavior that was so programmed into me that relief represented going back to a group like the message, because that's where I could be accepted. So I had to redefine my experience and recognizing that I was actually a damaged little boy who came into the message to find relief. Because often we turn to dysfunctional relationships that we're used to in order to find peace, because that's where we function best in dysfunction. That was my story of going through the message. And I'm going to go into caring for the heart in a lot more detail. I actually don't harbor a lot of bitter feelings anymore about people and things that happened to me in that aftermath. I really do think most people are just blissfully deceived, and they haven't studied the issues of William Branham to the extent of what is available. They knew what they knew, much like my parents, much like I did when I preached the message. I knew what I knew. And so I've resolved a lot of it. I've come to a lot of healing and understanding of myself and of my experience. And the 10 years that have passed, it's over 10 years now. It's 11 years that has passed since I left the message. It's been a time of healing and a time of relearning. And life is very different now. And maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that as my podcast continues. But I can honestly say I was wholeheartedly invested in the message. I believed it to the absolute core. And the fact that I changed my mind, in my mind was just because I was honest with what I was seeing and reading, and I was not satisfied with glossing over problems, with platitudes, with dismissals of acceptance of the messenger because he is who he said he was. If I could look distinctly at the man's words and recognize that he contradicted himself repeatedly, then it behooves me to examine it further, because I'm staking my life on it, because I've accepted that he was a fully vindicated prophet. And vindication means to remove all doubt, all question about it. And yet the evidence was saying that there's actually some questions. So I want to answer some of those questions. And when those questions cannot be quenched or satisfied by an honest answer, then I took issue. I'm going to end here because I've gone on for a very long time, but thank you for listening. And maybe this will be illuminating for somebody who stops and listens to what I've shared here today. Leaving is difficult. I know this by experience.